Hi, I'm Aric Chen, Curatorial Director for Design Miami, and I want to thank you all for joining us for today's talk, hosted by Irthi Contemporary Crafts Council. The talk today will focus on environmental, social, and economic sustainability through heritage conservation, in particular in Beirut, and in the context of the arduous recovery effort facing that city after the devastating blast of August 4th this year. Now, on August 25th, Design Miami was honored to host a talk with R & Company and House of Today, a nonprofit platform supporting Lebanese designers, discussing their collaboration to aid designers affected by that blast. And for the past 6 weeks, we've been privileged to collaborate with the coalition Architects for Beirut in raising funds through the sale of drawings donated by over 100 leading architects, including David Adjaye, Toshiko Mori, Renzo Piano, Francis Carre, Young Ho Chang, and others through the shop.designmiami.com website. So clearly, what happened in Beirut deeply affected the design community and all of us globally, as nearly $100,000 was raised to support the Beirut Urban Lab through this effort and its work in both rebuilding and preserving that city. And such efforts are just beginning. And so we're grateful to Irthi today for continuing the discussion through this talk, and would like to thank them and the speakers for participating and for all the good work that they do. Thank you.
Welcome to today's discussion, Environmental, Social, Economic Sustainability through Heritage Conservation for Design Miami 2020. I'm Farah Nasri, and I will be moderating today's panel on behalf of Irthi Contemporary Crafts Council over the next hour or so. I'm the Assistant Manager for Curation and Design at the Council and the head and focal point for Sharjah UNESCO Creative City of Crafts and Folk Art for the Craft of Telli.
Irthi is an affiliate of Nama Women Advancement Establishment under the patronage of Her Highness Sheikha Jawahir bint Muhammad Al Qasimi, wife of His Highness the ruler of Sharjah and chairperson of Nama. Many of Her Highness's humanitarian entities have launched philanthropic initiatives aiding Lebanon's explosion victims, bringing life-saving aid, essential food supplies, healthcare, and shelter to thousands.
Irthi Contemporary Crafts Council joins Design Miami with a two-part program for Design Miami 2020, an exclusive online sale of handmade collaborative works between artisans and designers from the Menasiyah and Central Asian regions, along with this conversation we're about to have, bridging efforts on how we can all support craft, design, and architecture practices to revive Beirut as a city. Irthi Contemporary Crafts Council's role to support and preserve the culture and the crafts of the Menasiyah in conjunction with Design Miami's current role in adopting a fund in support of Beirut-based designers for Design Miami 2020 host a discussion to shed the light on the movable and immovable cultural heritage of Beirut that is an immediate need for safeguarding. Of course, we have an exceptional panel today, and I'm delighted to introduce Bernard Khoury, founder of Bernard Khoury Architects, who tackles the political, environmental, social, economic realities of Beirut through his craft that cannot otherwise materialize in an alternative context and urban space. His approach to the urban fabric is always reactive to the state that it's in, defining the city of Beirut at any given moment with a structure that allows for the sustainability of Beirut's narratives. His buildings have been termed with adjectives that one would use when describing Beirut itself. In 2001, he was awarded by the municipality of Rome the honorable mention of the Borromini Prize. In 2004, he was awarded the Architecture Plus Award. He's also the co-founder of the Arab Center for Architecture. In 2014, he was the architect and co-curator of the Kingdom of Bahrain's National Pavilion and the 14th Venice Biennale. Thank you for joining us. I'm also happy to introduce Nada Debs, founder of Beirut-based Nada Debs Studio, that spans scale and discipline from product and furniture design to one-off interior commissions. Nada travels the world finding connections between different cultures and crafts, and then translates this know-how through various craftsmanship juxtapositions, capturing the power of the human hand. In 2013, the studio was shortlisted for the prestigious Jamil Prize at the V&A in London for Nada's Concrete Carpet, a poetic meditation on Arabic script and Japanese calligraphy. Nada has participated in We Are All Beirut, a charity auction by Christie's to support the artistic and cultural restoration of Beirut after the blast. Proceeds were in benefit of the Arab Fund's Arts and Culture and the Lebanese Red Cross. Tessa and Tara, thank you for being here with us today. They are both the founders of Beirut-based T SAKHI Studio, a multidisciplinary architecture and design studio that places human interaction at the core of its practice, drawing from one's emotional and physical experiences by incorporating senses and memory. They were nominated for Emerging Designer of the Year by Design Awards in 2020. Their pavilion, Waltz, was nominated within the small scale and installation category on Arc Daily's Building of the Year. After the August 2020 blast, T SAKHI Studio have done several donations for Beirut through auction houses and NGOs such as Bebo Shibik, an NGO for the reconstruction of windows and doors of the destroyed homes after the blast. I will commence today's panel discussion with a quote from UNESCO. UNESCO describes World Heritage as our legacy from the past, what we live with today, and what we will pass on to future generations. Today, the conversation of Beirut's shared cultural heritage is essential at this point in time, as it provides us with its community and urban fabric an irreplaceable source of life and inspiration to a much paralyzed and confused Beirut post the August 4th blast. So Beirut's dire need for a coherent, well-coordinated policy towards preserving cultural heritage is being addressed by humble institutions that have begun to kickstart programs to address such conversations and conservations, as well as NGOs and volunteers carrying out the jobs of the state and the Ministry of Culture as a whole. Immovable heritage seems to take up cyclical narratives in Beirut. It's the 7th time Beirut has been severely damaged. Some structures have had an ongoing changing role from the civil war to today due to these cycles. Some of these roles have been dictated from a government or local authorities in the past. But today, my question is if the government or local authorities can even afford to make those buildings last. And is it environmentally, economically, socially even worth it for the government to go in and partake in such an activity at this point? I guess this question is mainly aimed at Bernard Khoury, whose buildings on plot 1063, 1072 along Charles El-Hilo Avenue and plot 450 on the northwestern edge of Beirut Central District were seriously affected, and whose probably its father's buildings as well, Khalil Khoury, have withstood a similar fate in the past. So I wanted to see your take on this kind of cyclical approach to Beirut's buildings or cultural heritage.
Well, first of all, what government? I've given up on institutions, on so-called state institutions here decades ago. So I'll rewind back to the early 90s. And you have to understand that in the early 90s, during the so-called post-war period and the so-called reconstruction period, the government was completely absent. Beirut is a very unique example in terms of the model that was used for its reconstruction. First of all, the reconstruction was limited to a very small perimeter. I'm quite familiar with the subject. You mentioned my father. He was very central in the 1977 reconstruction plan for the Central District after the first round of the Civil War. And it's interesting to see what precedes the Architectural Act and understand what were the mechanisms at the time to kickstart that reconstruction, what was planned in 1977. The private sector was already in their scenario very present, but the state was still there. So it's interesting to understand in what we thought was a post-war reconstruction effort in 1977, what the formula, what formula was possible at the time, and then you see in the early 90s another formula on the table, which is really unique in the history of cities. the reconstruction of the Beirut Central District in the early 90s was the largest real estate project. That's what it was on the planet. It was the largest real estate project on the planet, and the state was totally absent. Whatever happened, and for the better or the worse, a lot of people criticized Solidaire's approach. There were some very good things about it. There were some things I was very critical about. But the central questions to me were very political. It took me a few years in the early 90s and the mid 90s to understand that there was no real reconstruction in the real sense of the term. Reconstruction is not about reconstruction of buildings, but it's about state institutions, the rebuilding of the state. And that never really happened. So what 30 years later, you see the blast of the port, and to me, it really falls under this logic. The war never ended. It never really stopped. And that's why very early on in my career, I was very cautious about the term reconstruction, because reconstruction means that at some point there was something, and then there was an accident, there was demolition, and then you come back and you rebuild. That didn't happen. And in fact, Beirut didn't stop its growth during the 70s and 80s. It's not like there was an accident and then the accident was over. There were some mechanisms of defense, there was a new metabolism to the city that developed during the 70s and the 80s. And the city was still growing, in fact. And then the 90s came. And to me, this falls under sort of a continuous, very chaotic history that we cannot write at this point and we cannot agree upon. So there's no reconstruction, and I'm dealing now with 3 buildings that are very severely damaged. One of them we've started redesigning, and I would not rebuild it. It'll certainly not be rebuilt exactly as it was, as I think amnesic buildings that have no memory, are stupid buildings. So I think this is Beirut. This is Beirut in the total bankruptcy of the state, in the total bankruptcy of the political systems, of the conventional political territory where you practice politics. There were no real politics practiced, at least in the so-called post-war period. Nothing that qualifies as politics, nothing that deals with social issues, economical issues, cultural issues, and so on and so forth. So this is a very complex environment, and the war is not over and there is no reconstruction. There are mechanisms of defense and an immunity that is at work here. There was no major break on August 7th. It falls on in the continuity of this complete political bankruptcy. And I believe that artists and architects should find other territories to practice politics, to produce meaning outside of the conventional political territories where politics are practiced in the more stable environments.
And also, like, the proof of never having a government taking care of the reconstruction is like being aware and looking at Beirut being very patched and stitched, very contradictory elements put like next to one another, and then having all this contradiction with one another also. And we never like had a real vision of where our city or our culture will go. And I really, like Bernard mentioned, I really hope that this time will not go into, again, reconstructing or rehabilitating the old buildings without having any memory, without even acknowledging what happened during the 4th of August, because I think that it's a really important like stratification to have within the city. And we cannot continue always reconstructing Beirut and having our government actually control our minds with amnesia, with collective amnesia. And it's portrayed perfectly well in all of Beirut. I mean, the only traces of war, if you want, or scars of war, are the egg, which we always talk about, Holiday Inn, and etc. Like, we can count them. I'm not saying also to be like stuck in time, but also to create all these layers and to acknowledge our past, to be able to evolve from that, because we feel like we're going back and forth with the same story over and over again.
And this being said, Tara and I, we haven't lived the Civil War because we were born in the 90s. So we don't have obviously the same experience as Bernard and Nada, like what they saw. We only saw what happened during the 4th of August blast. And so our opinion is very much linked to that. And so we kind of understand and well see it through their eyes what must have happened also during the Civil War, and the whole idea of like a city that has not properly been reconstructed, or that is led by a corrupted government that does not in any sense give like social, economical, or support.
I wasn't here for this. I arrived to Beirut in the year 2000. But since then, I've renovated my spaces at least 5-6 times. So, we're constantly, and the thing is, it's really on false basis, we keep reconstructing. And I did reconstruct my studio the day after August 4th. I mean, I made a very quick decision, but I know knowingly that we are building on very fragile ground. So it's been, like Bernard was saying, we're really working independently and autonomously, and we have no choice, really.
And it seems like this endless process with no particular framework of beginning to end. But there have been different strategies utilized or assigned by different kinds of funds to preserve the affected craft, design, or architecture renovation and restoration projects in Beirut. So how are creative and cultural aids restoring projects and safeguarding tangible and intangible heritage in Beirut? Maybe Sakhi, you could elaborate on that further from your experience with Bebu Shubik, as well as other experiences that you might have had either in your personal kind of studio or beyond that.
Okay, so what was really clear at the beginning of the first few days after the blast is that we did not even think about, people were not thinking about durability or creating or talking about the heritage and trying to create something which will persist in time. But because of the emergency of the state of the city, people were just trying to be effective and renovating and closing doors. I'm talking specifically about with Bebu Shubik, what we're doing, we're closing doors and windows, but also trying to respect the existing. But every time we went to certain spaces, we would see that the whole building, each floor was renovated in a certain way. And wooden old frames were replaced by aluminium, really commercial aluminium, CDEM 2000 profiles. So that was a question that we discussed within the NGO, is how do we actually want to renovate, and why not take a whole building and take that as a responsibility? But because of the chaotic environment, it was really, really hard to even control and to have the NGOs were not at the beginning actually communicating with one another, but I think today it's happening more and more, which is positive. But at the end of the day, the NGOs are trying to do the work of a state, and I kind of think it's very challenging. I do have a lot of hope, but at the same time, it's really
it's chaotic, because when you have so many different NGOs and they're not really communicating with one another. So what was happening is that, let's say in one building, every floor was renovated or taken by a certain NGO. So this created also a lot of chaos, and it was more about like Tara said, it's just to provide shelter for the people, and not thinking long term and sustainability wise, and also preserving, yes, our cultural heritage, but then you have also an economical issue, is how do you first of all get the raw materials and the raw goods, because we import also everything, and how do you pay for them?
I think what's been done by what we call the civil society is really impressive. I haven't been involved very precisely with any of those, but But as a spectator, I think what was done is amazing by these associations. Again, in the absence, the complete absence of the state. But on another positive note, I'm just trying to bounce on what Tara was saying. It's true that, and it's really too bad that we are sometimes, a lot of people are resorting to off-the-shelf building practices, construction materials that we've been very lazy, and that the construction industry has imposed on us, such as replacing wood windows with imported profiles or types of profiles. But on a positive note, for instance, we're dealing with a building, at least one of the cases where we've managed to organize the convalescence. I like to call it convalescence rather than rehabilitation. I had a meeting with, it's quite a big building. I think there are 65 co-owners. And what I've explained to them is that back in 2009, 2010, working with a big developer, kind of a corporate developer, imposed on the architects and us basically the use of certain materials that may be used in Dubai, in Shanghai, in Houston, in Beirut, exactly the same way, because the dollar was at 1,507 liras, and we were living in a financial bubble, an economical bubble, and we were not allowed to experiment or make use of local know-how. I tried to do that in many projects. It was easier on smaller scale projects, but sometimes when you hit a bigger scale, you've got quantity surveyors, you've got what I call the hegemony of the building industry that basically imposes itself on you. After the blast, I come back to these people and I tell them, today the situation is different. And I would love to see that happen on, maybe I'm too optimistic, but on other fronts also beyond our building. What I've tried to tell these people is that maybe this is the chance for us to reconnect with local artisans and the local construction industry. Today, if we were to replace conventional building methods that are off the shelf, universal, in our rehabilitation, we have to pay what we call fresh money with foreign currency. And that becomes extremely heavy and difficult. On the other hand, if you convert that into local currency and you see what you can do with that locally, you can do wonders. I'm really hoping that this readjustment, this sad story of the economical collapse, will revive local practices. So we're just beginning now to look at quite a large structure with, I think, close to 20,000 square meters of built-up area that we're going to rebuild, or we're going to stitch with making use literally of technologies or artisanal practices that we were no longer allowed to use on large-scale projects, simply because of economical reasons. Because today, with the equivalent of $120 a square meter that you get from China, you can do stuff by converting raw material locally, and you could do things you cannot dream of doing in Japan or in Europe at 4, 5, 6 times the price. I want to add to that also that there is amazing know-how, and I've played with that, particularly in my smaller scale projects and in the early years of my career, where we did things that were very unorthodox relative to the construction industry. But yet, they worked out very well because they were very local. So we're trying to reconnect with the local artisans, this breed that is disappearing and was about to completely vanish because of the dictatorship, literally, of the construction industry. So I'm hoping that we're going to revive these practices. Maybe this unfortunate event will bring back some practices that were about to disappear in the construction sector, and also on the level of the industry. I'm thinking of Nada.
And we already have a lot of skills people cannot do outside, and that's the only reason why I'm doing what I'm doing. Otherwise, I would have been outside doing it, you know? So definitely. I think that, we have a lot of skills, and we have people who still think the old way. And, we can take advantage of us because people are now into things that we want to be in touch with. We're now closer to our home, to our pieces, to things we touch and tangible things. And this is where I think we're very strong in that, in this part of the region. Like even when it comes to furniture, we do very high-end luxury crafted pieces. And it's a bit like haute couture, compared to, we're not good at pret-a-porter, we're not good at mass production. And so this is a strong strength. For me, the challenge is now, 3 days after the blast, I was in Tripoli because I felt like I needed to see what's happening there, if we can produce things there for Beirut, not doors, but actually furniture. And I went to visit a lot of cabinet makers, and most of them have no work at all. And I was thinking, how can these people, how can we provide, opportunities for work for them? Because I kept asking them, what do you want? And they said, please, we just want work. We just want to work. We don't want to be just given food or money. We want to be able to work and sustain our work. And they all have skills. So I said, do you have carvers? Do you have any, what are your, the craftsmen that you have? And he said, I used to have 20 carvers. Now I only hold on to one because the rest there's no work for them. And they're sitting and driving trucks or taxis. So he goes, but if you provide work, we're going to be able to, bring them back. So for me, I think that it's very important right now, actually look at who we have here and find opportunities and demand outside in order for them to start working. They do have skills, for sure, Bernard, like Bernard was saying. They do have skills that we can tap onto. And so, I feel that I'm very hopeful about that. I really believe that the human power is still there.
Yeah, I think that kind of mapping is going to be so essential to cross-pollinate the artisan or the craftsman to the designers like yourself, Nada, or architects like Bernard, and then to see how all that fits together for a framework that could possibly be a more successful framework for unleashing the kind of method for this kind of reconstruction or innovation of technology and craft and all these practices. But in the process of restoration, craftsmen sometimes may actually create further damage without maybe knowing. If they get into maybe a certain structure that they don't know much about. And my question is, should cultural heritage professionals working towards safeguarding the built environment offer these local craftsmen training to not further wreck maybe certain Beirut damaged buildings, or even maybe furniture items or designed items or interior fit-outs that may be there? I believe, Bernard, you've coined the term evolving scars, which is a sustainable concept of rehabilitating buildings by displaying traces of war and then putting them to new uses, instead of completely tearing them down and then denying their past. Could you tell us more from hands-on experience how that was achieved? Or Nada, as you were talking about how this kind of manifests on a smaller scale object?
For me, yes, I've took remnants of old doors, and now we're doing a small collection, using those leftover door frames and doors, and trying to come up with ways of stitching. We're actually stitching them with craft. So that's something that I've been working on. And even our boutique downstairs on the main road in Jemin, I decided not to renovate it and to keep it completely dismantled the way it was and just putting a facade, because I felt this obligation to keep a little memorial on the street, because presently everything is under construction. And I feel like, maybe when people are driving at night, it'd be nice to just see where we were and where we are today. And the fact that we're progressing is really positive. But I think, like, Tessa and both of you were saying, that it is important to not forget and to know that we are progressing, that we know how to take what we have, but then do it better. And I think that's what Lebanese design is, in a way. I don't feel we have a very strong identity as a Lebanese, but I think the attitude is very much of that, where we're always out doing ourselves, working on improving all the time. So it's nice to see progress in what we do.
Yeah, and I don't look at restoration. I wouldn't like to look at restoration in the very limited sense of the term. Some people have a very narrow definition of what historical preservation is. Some people like mummies, and I don't think history should limit itself to the preservation of mummies. I think the problem we have in the Arab world in general, that we've had here in the early 90s and we still suffer from, is the impossibility of the Arab to exist in the present. So there's always this past, this notion of the past, which is sometimes dangerously simplified. And then there is the future. I often make reference to Solidaire's famous motto, Beirut, Medina, Ariqa lil Mustaqbal. It's very interesting. A city very deeply rooted in the past for the future. It completely bypasses the present. And I think interesting history is a history that starts from the present and that connects things relative to a very clear perception at some point in time, at a very specific moment in time. And that's how people formulate, that's how people and civilizations have formulated their histories. The problem with Arabs and our relationship to the present, to modernity in general, is our impossibility to exist in the present. I'm someone who's very much rooted in the present. And I think this is where history starts. You look back and then you look forward. Medina Ariqa lil Mustaqbal bypasses the present. And it's interesting to see back in the 90s what was considered as historical. 6 archaeological layers, the leftovers of the Ottoman Empire, and maybe the French Mandate, but at some point everything stops in 1943. So there is no reference to the modern Beirut or the independent republic that had a shot at modernity. That was completely wiped out. So, you look at August 4th, you look at the blast. Of course, it is important to preserve traces of the Levantine period. I totally understand that, and I have a lot of sympathy for those who do it well and do it properly. But history doesn't stop there. History is also in the making, and that's extremely important. And I think the problem we have is our incapacity to formulate that, to deal with our scars. We're in complete denial. We look at the past sometimes as an dangerously simplified postcard. That, if anything, we didn't even formulate. That is sometimes the fantasy of the West at the end of the day, or historians that have written our history and we completely comply with. And then when it comes to the future, we import modernity. See, it wasn't the case back in the 50s, the 60s, and even the 70s, the glorious 30 years of the modern republic that my father was part of. These people thought they could exist in the present. The problem with my generation is that most of us have sort of given up on that. I'm not talking about architects only. I'm talking about those who make the situations possible prior to architecture. We are not given a shot at modernity. So I'm at war with those people who have a very limited sense of what history is and what history can be.
I was saying that I agree with Bernard. We cannot just stick to what was the past. We have to add our input. So, in that aspect, what I like to do with the craftsmen is like change the craft actually and give it a new life so that we can sustain it for future generations. So it's not the same craft. It is the same craft, but we're adding new materials we work with today, not just past, in order to kind of give it an upgrade. So I think it's so true that we don't give it enough attention. We have a lot to offer, I think, as designers and as people here. There's many layers in us, and we can apply that in our work, I think. So it's interesting. But yeah, I hope everyone will listen to you, Bernard.
Yeah. And we also feel like kind of the Western cities or the Western part thinks that when we want to conserve our heritage, it means directly that we want to conserve the typical Lebanese houses with the 3 arcades. But at the same time, like, it's more than that. It's about preserving a way of life which is portrayed through architecture or design, and like having like testimonies of the present moment that we live throughout time. We have not, like Bernard was saying, we didn't stop in the 1920s or before that, when we had a whole evolution of how also we transformed these houses to accommodate our modern way of life and so on. Even the cities, even Jumeirah and Mar Mikhael have shifted so much, and we have added so many layers. Sometimes like we have added some negative and some more positive layers, but in general, like, it has shifted completely as a urban scape.
It's true. It's more like preserving those kind of processes or documenting all these processes to just know what actually got us to where we are today, and then to assess the way forward. But it's not like, okay, this is how it was and it should always be that way, and then, or project on what it should be because, as you said, of Western ideas or any other ideas. But as we were talking about immovable heritage, it's a heritage that you build and you live in at the same time, and then that serves as your context provider, or it serves as a way for you to identify with a certain place or a built environment, and it delineates where we are today and where we will be heading to as a culture in the future. And then the relationships between environmental, social, economic, and craft sustainability are intertwined with when you zoom in to like maybe the studio structures that are in need of renovation and adaptive reuse in the city of Beirut, with Beirut-based studio spaces mainly being situated around the areas that you just mentioned, like Mar Mikhael, Jumeirah, and also the Surso area, several hundred meters from the port. Could you please highlight the status of these cultural spaces, creative spaces, and craft-led design businesses in Beirut's ecosystem? I know that your studios are probably situated around that area, Nada, and how is that area functioning as people and as practices today?
It's still very quiet. First of all, the residences are not there. The people who live in that area are not there anymore. They're coming back eventually, and the whole street is really under construction. So you see the heritage buildings are being scaffolded. Some coffee shops have started to open up. In my building, the building I'm in, it's a 1930s, very big building block, and none of the spaces have been fixed yet. So it's construction everywhere. They're still building, still windows, doors. It takes a lot of time. So you see, it's very, very noisy, but there is reconstruction. Everyone is fixing. Even people who said they weren't going to be fixing are fixing now. So, there's something very contagious about Beirut when someone starts something, so when people see other coffee shops opening, then they start, opening, also fixing. What I noticed is there's one of the NGOs, Beit el Baraka. They were actually going through the very small shops, like the grocery stores and the barber shops, and they were They had a fund to donate to these people because they felt that these were the little nodes in the street that would help bring back the residential people and bring back like movement. So, like for example, the grocer closes at 3 p.m. because there's nothing for him to do after 3 p.m. because there's no one living there now. But I think eventually, when people start coming back, I think there will be life again. Maybe this time it will be a more studied life, like because there was no, people built on top of each other. They just built. They didn't really have a plan or a strategy. But now I feel like when they're renovating, there's a little bit. It's not in a global scale, but they're rethinking the spaces better. I mean, that's the positive side of it.
Well, we left the country. Our space was destroyed because we also work 4 kilometers away from the blast, so our space was quite destroyed. I think, well, at least I'm going to talk personally. What was important for me is to kind of heal psychologically from the trauma, and bit by bit, like getting back energy makes me be a bit more like productive and creative. Now that I'm outside of Lebanon, I feel that like I'm a bit more like composed in a sense where I want to give much more to my country, and eventually like I would want to come back, yes, but I just feel now it's a bit still too sensitive and weak, I would have to say. So, well, personally for us, for my sister and I, it's very difficult to sustain in Lebanon. I'm sure like everyone is also struggling. So it's very much the idea of like trying to find work outside and trying to sustain outside in order for us to come back to the country with a stronger foundation, and in order for us to be able to rebuild ourselves in the city also.
As the entire post-COVID community resorts to the mapping of either online exhibitions to sustain themselves, together with creating these virtual buildings or landscapes, renderings of either artworks or furniture pieces. Do you think that this kind of virtual mapping of buildings could be helpful in documenting the current state of the immovable cultural heritage of Beirut towards a more sustainable preservation? Much of Bernard Khoury's work is a reaction to a war or to many kind of happenings, recognizing them and then confronting this kind of different social realities. While T Sakhi, you're more on setting new experiences and new memories for the city and for the people. I guess this question is to all of you. How would you envision sustainable preservation to look and operate like, ideally, in your opinion?
I think that this has started not only for me, for all of us present here on this panel, way before then, as each one of us in a different way built his or her own strategy to operate and to produce meaning on this very complex, explosive and very toxic territory that Beirut is. So I look at my 3 buildings that were on the front line, and it's interesting to note that these buildings very clearly when they were conceived, some in 2010, 2012, whatever, so they're almost 10 years old, at least on the drawing board, very much addressed the very unstable fabric they were standing on very clearly, as if they were almost ready for this confrontation. All 3 buildings that are on the front line that you've mentioned had very defensive postures, some very, very visible, with mechanisms of defense. The Saifi 450 building was built on the phobia of security and has absurdly sophisticated security devices all around it. And besides it being shaped by the setback laws, which becomes secondary, it is a building that really was generated by its relationship to the fabric, its relationship to Beit al-Kateh, facing it, the very traumatizing events that have happened in the mid-70s on that demarcation line, its geographical location on an extremely sensitive axis. It's very interesting to see that after the October 17 revolution, it became again another demarcation line. But then the port is another demarcation line. And to me, Beirut is a port city. All three buildings address the port in the way they sit on the grid, in their articulations, in many references they make to the port. So it's as if they were ready for that to happen, or at least they were prepared for that. The building, the so-called skyline, which I hate the name of, I don't give names to my buildings, the developers do. I find them very cheesy, but really looks like some kind of sentinel sitting facing the port way prior to the blast, and it paid its price. So I think everything we do here, whether it's post August 4th or 10 years from now or 10 years ago, has to very much address the specificity of our fabric. I never looked to what was happening on the so-called international architectural scene when I was conceiving of my buildings. What interests them does not interest me. I'm very much je suis un défenseur du local. I really very much believe in the local. And the proof of that is that you see what the so-called international architects did when they came to Beirut. They were, their statements and their posters are so naive. They don't know the territory. It's very simplistic what they state, and whatever position they take is meaningsless, absolutely meaningless. They're like kids wandering in the dark when they come to Beirut. They work on the tip of their toes. And when they produce stuff in the Gulf, same story again. All they can do is reproduce formulas that were developed in different contexts at a different period in time. And what you get is a collection of second-rate replicas or specimens of things that you've already seen. That's what I call the Arab bankruptcy, culturally and politically. So I would very much encourage the locals to have the guts to assume and really take positions that are very specific to them. This is the only way to be global, in my opinion, today. Being global can happen while working geographically on a very specific territory. I think this is where the future is. I'm not interested in building museums in Berlin or social housing in the suburbs of Toulouse. To me, there's nothing political in that. They're very consensual projects. Beirut puts you at the forefront, of really where the battle is happening, with very explosive issues. And I think this is where this is a very interesting territory where the architect and the designer can claim back his political role beyond the very consensual and flat trends of architecture today, as the guardians of our practice try to promote it. I'm not interested in what they do. They're not interested in what I do. I'm not interested in their awards. I think they're meaningless. I think the international scene is completely bankrupt on a political level. If you want to produce meaning today, it's in areas that really are in convalescence, areas where the political issues are very they blow up in your face, and not in the very secure environments where the good is good and the bad is bad. An institution that precedes architecture, that formulates a project for you establishes already a very consensual posture. So come back to Beirut, all of you. We need you.
Definitely.
Your mind, with your brains, with your efforts, with your postures, and you are here. You have to fulfill your historical role of, this is true resistance. This is politics. This is this is to me the very interesting territory of politics. It's what you do, and if you give up on doing that, then this is where I think we would have lost the war, not the battle.
You know, growing up abroad, I was a bit ashamed of being an Arab, you know, but when I came to Beirut, I saw how people were also a little bit more taken by the Western world. And I reacted in a very, angry way, because it was reflecting how I was feeling and I didn't like it. And so for me, it was very important that instead of people importing like French and Italian furniture, that it was our job to export and to let the world see the beauty of what we have. And so, one of my statements is local is the new global. And I think that you're saying people are not interested in what you say, Bernard. I think people are interested, but I really think that I'm with you, that I think we have to look at and find meaning with what we do and express the meaning through our work. So like in my case, it's all about identity and creating a modern identity in the Arab world. So, I took what we had, gave it a little bit of a contemporary twist, so that people today who are modern and contemporary can relate to the pieces, not just, revere in the past. So, and it gave, I believe that, when you approach, gives a lot of sense of purpose, even when you're in, and meaning, even in your identity. So when you're sitting around something that is contemporary, but that relates to your culture, you feel better. And I think that at the end, that's what's important, is, to feel better about who you are and where you are.
I think also what's interesting is to see like how in fragile environments like in Lebanon, we get to see certain truths and how like a country functions in a certain way, like in civilized, if you want, countries where everything is packed up and put in place. We don't get to see these very easily. So that's something I have noticed since the October Revolution, is that you feel like slowly things are fragmenting, but allowing you at the same time to see the links between them that I was at least not being able to see. The more we understand the structure of how a country works, at least our country, the way it works, the more we can try to create exactly that sustainable cycle into how we can actually integrate each of the different fields and how we can rebuild our city. And of course, like in each field, we have to be political, because politics is not only in the, like, let's say in the government or only for politicians. It comes with all the know-hows in all the city.
Bernard mentioned, where everyone's going back and seeing what's relevant, what's irrelevant, and maybe it's time to reassess craft processes or any other kind of processes and why we do what we do, especially that now there isn't so much of an economic kind of drive towards certain things, since everything slowed down in that sense. And but I think lastly, I just wanted to talk about the movable heritage in terms of objects that you would usually see in museums, or safeguarded in museums and exhibition spaces. I know, Bernard, you mentioned against building these monuments which house a certain era and house a certain kind of a timeline, and they kind of frame it in a certain format. But I think that both immovable and movable heritage, they both face the same challenges with sustainability. So how do you take a structure or an object and you prolong its usefulness beyond its certain point of inception, or extending the life of an object beyond its initial use? Movable heritage is heritage that is made and collected. So it could be a private collection by a private collector. It could be taken care by museums and other gallery spaces. So it could be books, journals, scholarly works, catalogs, prints, publications, and gallery pieces. I think that since everyone here produces more or less these kind of items that I think are collectible items or deemed that way internationally, how was the process of conservation for these kind of objects, and ever since the blast or even before that in Beirut? Is there a certain infrastructure for this kind of collection to happen and this kind of safeguarding to happen?
I think this has yes, but there are no structures like you would see in more stable environments again, and this brings us back to our incapacity to formulate any sort of consensual history around which we can build a national project. Everything is political, but this has pushed, I think, artists, architects, and designers to find their own strategies because they are not given the proper structures that one finds in other more stable environments. So we have to find our ways to practice, and that could be very, very interesting because it makes us get involved with things that precede architecture or precede design or precede art in general. I think artists in the West also have become, I call them in French, les fonctionnaires de l'art. I don't know how you would translate that into English, meaning there are systems that you can become a professional artist by following certain paths, and if you do it well, and same happens in architecture. You find yourself a chair in a university. You behave well. You fit in the mold of these very consensual definitions that basically delete any sort of exceptions beyond that very consensual line that within which they practice. They are very much protected by their cocoons, whether they're architects, academics, artists sometimes, and designers. They fit in this system that shelters them and protects them and numbs them in a way completely. Here, you don't have that. So you have to get out of your cocoon into the battlefield, into the mud, and really scratch your head, and sometimes deal with pirates and do things that are not very orthodox, but for the right cause. And I find that very, very much interesting. Yes, we don't have the mechanism. We wish we could have them, but they don't fall from the sky. A museum of contemporary art in Beirut today is an impossible proposition, simply because nobody is habilitated to formulate any sort of history of the past 40 or 50 years. You can look at my proposition with Walid Raad for the Bema Museum. It was called Préface. And what we proposed was a hall, not a building, because the building is impossible at this point. And we told them, don't make acquisitions because it's impossible to make acquisitions here, because nobody's going to agree on what the acquisition means and the history it represents. Look at private collections. Look at the 10, 15 collectors here who have collected things in a very absurd way, but they were not historically accountable. And they very much reflect the political contradictions of this territory. This is what a museum in Beirut is, not a museum not a system that you import from the West, because you just want to have a contemporary museum. That's stupid, that's absurd, that's dangerously naive. So really dig on what is very specific and sometimes extremely sour on your territory to produce relevant meaning. This is where it becomes sustainable at this point. If it's really intelligent, feasible, it works within the limits of the possible in this very chaotic and extremely complex political environment. And we should stop looking at Western models that we want to implement here, because there's something that precedes the museum and something that precedes the institution of the museum, and it is the political environment that makes that possible. At this point, it is not here. We're in a jungle, a political jungle, and we have to act upon that and according to that.
Streets of Beirut, the city itself is a museum also. When you walk around.
Yeah, because you confront all sorts of, like, if you call them movable or immovable heritage And so yeah, like the best museum for heritage in Beirut would be the city itself. And that's why it would be very important to commemorate what has happened to us, to be able to walk in 50 years in the streets and be able to understand what has happened just by walking in the streets and looking around. I mean, maybe a parallel scenario would be the city of Berlin, not comparing the two cities together, but Berlin has gone through so much. And when you walk through the city, you see all the traces and all the scars of what they have lived, whether like a small metal structure on the floor delineating where the wall was, or like in so many ways they have commemorated. So many people have criticized that because Berliners feel like they are so much stuck and having to obligated to always be remembered of what has happened to them.
Well, I mean, yes, now wherever I go, I see like replicas of my work. In a way, I take it as a compliment today. I mean, it wasn't when I first started. But what it has done is the fact that all these craftsmen, extending all the way to Syria and Egypt, they are actually doing new work. And for me, that's really important that they have something new to do, because before that they were doing the same things that were done for the Ottoman Empire. The Ottoman sultans, the same objects. So today, like, you can walk into a craft shop and they would have photocopies of some of my website pieces, and they're actually making the pieces themselves. Yeah, in a way, it's a ripple effect, and they have, something to do. They have a new way of thinking. And I think it's reaching out slowly to people to think out of the box. When my first backgammon game that I made was a circle, and everyone was complaining that they can't play on a circle. And I told them the point of that is not to play the game, but to just think out of the box, because we always need to see the backgammon as rectangular. So, it's just a way of getting people to change the way they think, see things in a new way. And I think after the blast, I think we are looking inwards more. We don't have time to look out. We're really so focused on what's in front of us. And one thing that we need to focus a lot on, I think, is youth empowerment, because, it proved during the blast how much the youth was so, excited and there to help out. And there's so much energy. And I think that we need to find a way to actually support the youth, because they have the ability and the potential. I'm trying to find ways where I can connect craftsmen with the young people.
It still gives us kind of like hope. Okay, you're still here and you're persistent and you're consistent, and it gives the younger generation more hope to come back and give our full energy, because at some point, I'm for you it must be much more than for us, but in the short span that we have been working, which was 4 years, you get crushed and demoralized.
It's been a tough journey, but I don't know what keeps me going. And I think that it's the fact that the people around are responding very positively to the fact that there is something about us in the region that we need to push. And I think it's getting, the audience is getting wider, the appreciation for what we do. But something I noticed very much, and I think we all know it, is that always the craftsmen are the uneducated and the designers are the educated. And somehow I want to find a better link between craft, maybe the educated people can work with their hands. Because when you look around in Japan or in England or anywhere in France, master craftsmen are revered. Here we don't really hear of any names of craftsmen. There's nobody. And so, this is something I think that we need to work on. And I'm trying to work in Tripoli with with the youth to see if I can get the youth to, maybe one or two of them or a few of them would be interested into taking a craft further, and taking it seriously.
Yeah, because it's also certainly very interesting to see how like a certain know-how and a heritage of a know-how that we have acquired could also evolve in time. Because I mean, the way our brains are shaped has evolved. So if we understand the craft ourselves, maybe we can make that evolve exactly to portray the way we live right now.
Yeah, but Nada, I totally agree with you. Like, let's say we learn a lot from the craftsmen we work with, because they have incredible know-how and they have so many years of experience. And with the fact that we also like not knowing, well, it's a good balance between designers, let's say, and the youth not knowing the know-how per se, because then they go back to thinking outside of the box, kind of like what you were referring to. As opposed to the craftsmen, they do have the know-how, but they're so stuck into doing the same thing for so many years that they don't really see outside of the box anymore. So combining these two together makes actually a very interesting product and quite evolved product.
And that would be beautiful for the reconstruction of Beirut, because that's exactly and precisely the way we can reconstruct it to portray ourselves today.
I think through these conversations, I think we can figure out ways where we could, different people and different organizations and different entities could take up part of responsibilities and go further and develop the way forward. So thank you all very, very much for joining us. And I hope you enjoyed the discussions.